Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we enter the world of Miss Marple in the scandal at the Conservator's Salon. A refined gathering shatters when a crime is uncovered. A fragile clue hides in plain sight, and one question lingers: who would risk everything for revenge? Now, light a candle, get comfortable, and let the mystery begin. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever it may be, lean closer, for the quiet town of St. Mildred's is about to be unsettled. The evening had begun with an air of refinement. The Conservator's Salon, a genteel little establishment where ladies displayed embroidery, music students performed, and fine teas were poured, was hosting its quarterly gathering. Villagers came dressed in their Sunday best, eager for conversation, gossip, and a touch of culture. At the center of it all, Miss Marple sat in a cushioned chair, her knitting needles clicking quietly, her soft blue eyes wandering the room. She looked harmless, like a sweet old lady enjoying a harmless diversion, but those who knew her well might have noticed the way she paused when listening, the way her glance lingered a second too long on a raised voice or a nervous gesture. It was during the interlude, when cups rattled and scones were served, that a small but telling incident occurred. A porcelain teacup slipping from Mrs. Alicia Fortescue's hand was no ordinary accident, for her fingers trembled as though she had seen something dreadful. The teacup smashed on the polished floor, and gasps filled the room. "Clumsy, clumsy me," Alicia murmured, though her eyes darted not at the fragments, but toward the heavy velvet curtain behind the platform where the amateur quartet was preparing their music. Miss Marple noticed at once the fear was not of the broken china, but of what or who she had glimpsed. The evening resumed, though whispers filled the salon like a low hum of bees. Mr. Lionel Harcourt, the proprietor and self-styled conservator of culture, attempted a joke about fragile crockery, but his voice cracked, betraying irritation. He was known for his temper, particularly where his salon's reputation was concerned. It was only minutes later, as the quartet struck their first notes, that the true disturbance occurred. A scream cut through the music. Guests rushed to the curtained alcove. Behind it, sprawled unnaturally on the floor, lay the body of Mrs. Alicia Fortescue, her lifeless hand still clutching the lace edge of her shawl. The room descended into chaos, sobs, shouts, and orders for the constable. Yet amid the storm, Miss Marple remained still, her head slightly inclined as if considering the pattern of her knitting. She noted the way Mr. Harcourt wrung his hands without once approaching the body, the way young Clara Withers, the pianist, whispered too urgently to her companion, and the curious fact that Alicia's handbag had vanished entirely. A death at the Conservator's Salon is shocking, scandalous, and far too deliberate to be chanced. Stay with us until the end. Only then will the truth be revealed. The atmosphere in the Conservator's Salon had shifted from polite refinement to a hushed frenzy. The guests, still dressed in their finery, were no longer sipping tea and discussing embroidery. They huddled in uneasy knots, whispering, their eyes darting toward the curtained alcove where Mrs. Alicia Fortescue had been found sprawled lifeless. Miss Marple, seated calmly near a small table set with cooling teapots, continued to knit, her needles clicking softly as though nothing in the world could disturb her rhythm. Yet her eyes, keen and alert beneath their gentle lids, flickered to every movement, every exchange of words. She knew well that in such moments, truth often slipped out disguised as chatter. It was not long before Constable Barnes entered, red-faced and slightly out of breath. The good man had been pulled from his supper at the local inn, and his boots bore crumbs of soil from his hurried journey. He looked about with visible unease at the gathered company, all of them far better dressed than he. "Now then," he said loudly, puffing out his chest, "let's have a bit of order here. Step back, if you please. No one touches anything. This is a matter for the police." Mr. Lionel Harcourt, the proprietor, immediately stepped forward, adjusting his waistcoat with theatrical dignity. "Constable, I assure you, my salon has never witnessed such a tragedy. I demand that every precaution be taken. This establishment's reputation is at stake." Miss Marple's lips twitched slightly, though she kept her gaze on her knitting. It was curious, she thought, how swiftly Harcourt's concern turned to reputation rather than to poor Mrs. Fortescue's body. One of the younger ladies, Clara Withers, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. I saw her only moments before. She whispered to her companion, a tall, sullen young man with ink-stained fingers. She looked so pale, almost frightened. The young man, whom Miss Marple recalled, was named Henry Grafton, replied too sharply. "Nonsense. She was simply nervous, that's all. These things happen. Weak hearts and such." Miss Marple looked up briefly, her expression mild. Weak hearts and such indeed. But Alicia's eyes had not been those of a woman weakened by illness. They had been wide, startled, as if she had recognized something or someone she should not have. Meanwhile, Constable Barnes knelt awkwardly by the body, careful not to crease his trousers. "Seems sudden," he muttered, scratching his head. "Though I'll admit I've no skill in such matters. Dr. Liddon should be summoned at once." At that, Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, spoke up with trembling indignation. "Constable, surely you don't mean to imply natural causes. A woman doesn't scream and collapse like that without reason." Her words were followed by a ripple of murmurs. Gossip was rising like steam from the teapots. One gentleman swore he had seen Mrs. Fortescue arguing earlier in the evening with Mr. Harcourt. Another claimed she had been overheard at the grocer's, making some veiled remark about a scandal soon to break. Each voice raised suspicion higher, until the air itself felt charged with accusation. Miss Marple allowed her needles to rest in her lap and spoke, her tone quiet, almost apologetic. "If I may, Constable, I should think it very odd that Mrs. Fortescue's handbag is nowhere to be seen. Ladies of her sort rarely part with them, you know. A place for everything and everything in its place. If it has gone missing, it must be of some interest." The room stilled. It had not occurred to most that Alicia's belongings were absent. Constable Barnes blinked, then straightened clumsily. Yes, indeed, Miss Marple. A very good point. We'll look for it." Mr. Harcourt shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking to the door that led to the side corridor. His hand twitched at his pocket watch as if time itself were pressing upon him. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her voice remained pleasantly conversational. "It is most peculiar. Handbags, in my experience, can tell more about a person than they ever realize. The things people carry close to them often reveal more than words." There was a silence, broken only by the sound of Clara Withers dropping her teaspoon onto her saucer. She flushed scarlet and muttered something inaudible to Henry Grafton, who gave her a quick, warning look. The arrival of Dr. Liddon, the village physician, brought fresh commotion. He was a portly man, always brisk, and tonight he wasted no words. After kneeling beside Mrs. Fortescue and conducting a few hurried examinations, he straightened and shook his head gravely. "She is gone. No question of revival. The heart may have failed, though his brow furrowed. There is a curious odor about her lips. Bitter, not unlike almonds. It may be nothing, but I advise great care. We must await a proper inquest." An audible gasp followed his words. Almonds. Every villager knew the whisper carried with it a shadow of cyanide. Constable Barnes turned pale, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Poison, then? Lord above, best not leap to conclusions, Doctor," Liddon warned, though his grave expression spoke otherwise. "But until we know more, I suggest you keep the scene secure. The body must be taken under official examination." As the doctor stepped back, Miss Marple's needles clicked once more. She leaned slightly toward the vicar's wife, her voice almost lost in the hum of anxious talk. It is so like those dreadful happenings one reads in the papers, is it not? A sip of tea too many, or perhaps a morsel touched by the wrong hand. Mrs. Partridge shivered. You cannot mean, but Miss Marple had already returned to her knitting, her face unreadable. In the corner, Clara Withers whispered urgently to Henry Grafton again, her words carried just far enough for Miss Marple to catch. We shouldn't have stayed. I told you it would happen. Henry hushed her with a glare, then turned to notice Miss Marple's mild blue eyes resting on him. He flushed and turned away quickly, spilling a few drops of tea as he lifted his cup with a trembling hand. Mr. Harcourt clapped loudly, his voice rising above the unease. That will do. Enough wild talk. We shall allow the authorities to handle matters. The Conservator's salon cannot be the site of idle gossip or slander. This was a tragedy, nothing more. Yet as he spoke, his hands shook slightly, betraying nerves he could not quite master. And in the tense hush that followed, Miss Marple's quiet observation lingered like a seed taking root in the minds of those present. Alicia's missing handbag, the bitter almond scent, and the curious behavior of those who had known her best. The salon's velvet curtains swayed gently as though stirred by an unseen draught, and in that restless motion lay the promise of secrets yet uncovered. What had begun as an evening of culture was now a chamber of whispers. And if there was one thing Miss Marple knew beyond doubt, it was that whispers often carried the truth, provided one knew how to listen. The question was who among them had reason enough for murder. And as the guests filed out reluctantly under Constable Barnes's uncertain command, one could not fail to notice that Mr. Harcourt lingered near the side corridor. Clara Withers wept too loudly for a woman she had only known casually, and Henry Grafton kept glancing toward the entrance as though fearing someone else might arrive. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, her gaze soft but piercing. In her mind, the pattern of human nature had already begun to form a pattern that would, in time, reveal a murderer. But for the moment, the salon echoed with hushed voices, a missing handbag, and the unmistakable scent of almonds. And outside, in the village square, the church bell struck 9, its solemn tolling carrying with it the weight of scandal. By the next morning, the quiet streets of St. Mildred's were no longer their usual picture of village calm. Word of Alicia Fortescue's death at the Conservator's salon had travelled faster than a summer storm. The villagers, known for their fondness for tidbits and tales, had wasted no time in embellishing every detail. At the bakery, Mrs. Hargreaves insisted she had heard that Alicia fell dead with a glass of sherry in her hand, though there had been no sherry served at the salon. At the greengrocer's, old Mr. Denton declared it was not poison at all, but a curse, muttering darkly about Alicia's late husband and debts unpaid. Miss Marple, with her shopping basket on her arm, listened with the quiet patience of one who understood human nature better than most. She purchased her currants, her bread, and her packet of tea, nodding gently as the shopkeepers leaned in with their theories. But while others seemed content to spread rumors, Miss Marple collected observations, small contradictions, peculiar turns of phrase, and the telling slips of the tongue that others overlooked. By mid-morning, Constable Barnes had set up a notice outside the salon declaring it closed pending investigation. He himself had grown puffed with importance, striding about with the air of one who believed he stood at the very heart of a grand case. Poison, that's what it was, he declared to anyone who would listen outside the post office. Plain as day, and we know who had the best chance to put it in her cup. The villagers leaned closer, their eyes bright. Barnes lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent it from carrying. That pianist girl, Clara Withers, she was seated nearest, wasn't she? Kept fidgeting, pale as anything. She served Alicia her tea. I'm certain of it. It can't be a coincidence. A chorus of nods and murmurs answered him. Already suspicion was settling like dust upon Clara's name. Miss Marple, who had paused with her basket at her side, spoke in her gentle, fluttering way. I should hardly think of Clara as the type, Constable. So very young, so eager to please. Girls of her sort are more apt to tremble at shadows than to administer poison. Don't you agree? Barnes flushed, unused to contradiction, particularly from Miss Marple. Well, all the same, she's the one folks saw closest to the tea tray. It's not natural the way she carried on last night, sobbing and such. If you ask me, guilty conscience make for dramatic displays. Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes mild. Or perhaps, she murmured, guilt and grief are not so easily told apart. I remember once in St. Mary Mead, a girl wept terribly when her kitten went missing. Everyone thought she was hiding mischief. It turned out she had done nothing wrong at all, merely felt more deeply than others allowed. Barnes shifted uncomfortably. Well, we'll see what the inspector says when he comes down from the division, but I'll not be letting Clara Withers out of my sight in the meantime. As the constable bustled away, Miss Marple continued her walk, her knitting bag bumping softly against her hip. She had noticed something that morning that troubled her. Henry Grafton, Clara's brooding companion, had slipped quickly into the chemist's before the shop had even opened, only to emerge a moment later, looking pale and glancing over his shoulder. Few had seen him, but Miss Marple's eyes were rarely idle. By noon, she had accepted an invitation to take tea with Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, who had been positively brimming with observations of her own. Seated in the vicarage drawing-room, with the lace curtains pulled just so, Mrs. Partridge leaned close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My dear Jane, you cannot imagine the things one hears." They say Mrs. Fortescue had written dangerous letters. To whom I cannot say, but Mr. Harcourt was seen receiving one only last week. I dare say she had him under her thumb. And you know how a man of his position would loathe that. Miss Marple stirred her tea with unhurried grace. "Blackmail," she said softly, almost as though to herself. Such a harsh word, but one hears it often enough. Human beings are inclined to use whatever weapons they possess. A letter can wound far more than a blade, don't you think? Mrs. Partridge shuddered, though her eyes gleamed with the thrill of it. Exactly so. And Harcourt, being such a proud man, might have thought to silence her before the scandal broke. Why, it would ruin the very salon he treasures. At that moment the vicar entered, adjusting his spectacles, his expression grave. "I would caution against such speculation," he said firmly, though his wife ignored him with the ease of a long habit. "The authorities will sort the matter properly. Gossip can destroy the innocent as quickly as it ensnares the guilty." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "How right you are, Reverend. And yet one must admit that gossip, when listened to carefully, often reveals more truth than people intend. A curious thing, human nature. One sees it over and over." She rose shortly after, thanking Mrs. Partridge for her hospitality, and made her way down the vicarage path. As she passed the square, she caught sight of Clara Withers herself. The girl looked pale, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. Beside her stood Henry Grafton, speaking in low, urgent tones. "You mustn't say a word about it," Henry hissed, his eyes narrowing. "Do you hear me, Clara? Not a word. You'll make things worse if you do." "I can't bear it, Henry," Clara stammered. "They all think it was me. And the bag, you know about the bag." Henry's hand tightened on her wrist. "Quiet," he snapped. "Keep your voice down. You'll ruin everything." Miss Marple, standing quite still behind the shade of a lamp-post, allowed her knitting bag to swing gently on her arm. She did not intrude, nor did she make her presence known. Instead, she simply noted the panic in Clara's voice and the iron in Henry's. Here was a thread worth following, as surely as the loose end of a ball of yarn. Later that evening, as the lamplighters made their rounds, the village green was alive with whispers. Some swore Alicia Fortescue had been poisoned by a rival in love. Others claimed she had been silenced because of debts or secret dealings. Still others, with an eye for drama, declared that Alicia's death was the first of many to come. In the drawing rooms and parlours of St. Mildred's, suspicion fixed itself more firmly on Clara Withers. She was young, nervous, and easily imagined as a culprit. That she had been nearest to the tea service seemed evidence enough for many. Only Miss Marple, seated by her hearth with her knitting needles clinking gently, remained unconvinced. She thought of Alicia's fearful glance before her cup had fallen, of Harcourt's peculiar fixation on his reputation, of Henry's sharp words to Clara, and of the missing handbag, still absent, still unexplained. Curious, she murmured to herself as she set down her knitting. Quite curious. A handbag, a whisper, and a very frightened girl. It does not add up. Not yet. And even as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple knew that beneath the cosy surface of her beloved village, something darker stirred. The truth was there, tangled among the lies and half-truths, waiting for the patient hand that could unravel it. Somewhere between a missing bag, a bitter taste of almonds, and a young girl's trembling hands lay the clue that would expose a killer. And in the heart of St. Mildred's, suspicion was only just beginning its work. The morning after the village's suspicions had thickened around Clara Withers, the girl found herself summoned to the small room adjoining the police station. It was hardly more than a converted storeroom, with a desk piled high with papers, a single chair for the accused, and a faint smell of damp ink. Constable Barnes, puffed up with the gravity of his task, sat opposite her, pencil poised above his notebook. Miss Marple, by what she called a little coincidence, but what others might have suspected was something more deliberate, had reason to pass near the station that morning. When Barnes saw her, he greeted her with a mixture of deference and discomfort. Somehow he felt her mild presence carried a kind of authority. She was invited in, ostensibly to provide reassurance to the nervous girl. Clara sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears. She looked scarcely older than a schoolgirl, though she was in fact in her 20s. Henry Grafton had insisted on accompanying her, but Barnes had barred him at the door. One voice at a time, he had said firmly. "This isn't a debate." "Now then, Miss Withers," Barnes began, his pencil scratching on the paper even as he spoke, "you were nearest to the tea service last night. You poured out Mrs. Fortescue's cup, did you not?" Clara hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. "I poured tea for several of the ladies. Mrs. Fortescue was among them." "But I didn't just answer plainly." Barnes interrupted. "You poured it, and shortly after, she collapses. Dr. Liddon says there was the smell of bitter almonds. That means poison, doesn't it? And poison comes from someone slipping it into her cup." Clara's lips trembled. "I didn't put anything in it. I swear. I only poured the tea." Miss Marple, sitting slightly to the side, spoke in her gentle manner. "I expect Clara is quite right, Constable. You see, young ladies often serve tea at gatherings. It is considered polite, and she would hardly be the only one with her hand to the teapot. And if I recall correctly, Mrs. Fortescue did not drink her tea at once. She set it down, did she not?" Clara looked at Miss Marple with something like gratitude. Yes, she did. She left it on the side table for a moment. She was talking to Mr. Harcourt. Barnes frowned. "Be that as it may, it was still in your hands first. Opportunity, Miss Withers. That's what counts." "But opportunity," Miss Marple said mildly, "is such a curious word. One must always ask, opportunity for whom? A cup of tea, once set down, is never truly safe from wandering hands. Why, I recall at a church fete, Mrs. Nichols set her cup down to speak to a friend, and when she returned, her tea had gone cold because another guest had taken it by mistake. Such muddles happen far more often than one realizes. Barnes grunted, unconvinced, though he scribbled something down in his notebook. Clara wrung her hands together. "They all think it was me," she said brokenly. "But I didn't. I only wanted to help, and now they whisper everywhere I go." Miss Marple reached over and patted the girl's hand softly. "The truth has a way of shining out, my dear, however clouded it may seem for the moment." There was a short pause. Clara seemed about to speak again, but she pressed her lips together tightly instead. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed it at once. The words unspoken were often as telling as those voiced. Clara was holding something back, and it was not simply fear. Just then, a knock came at the door. Constable Barnes opened it to find Henry Grafton standing stiffly, his ink-stained fingers clutching his hat. His face was set, his eyes dark with resentment. "I must insist," Henry said coldly, "that you release Miss Withers. She's no criminal. Dragging her name through the mud will do nothing but harm." Barnes bristled. "This is police business, Mr. Grafton. You'll do well to remember your place." Henry's gaze flicked to Miss Marple, and his jaw tightened. "And what place does she hold here?" "She's no officer of the law." Miss Marple smiled benignly. Her knitting bag balanced neatly on her lap. "Oh, I'm no more than an old woman who has seen much of human nature. And human nature, you know, is often the best witness of all." Henry's lip curled, but he said nothing more. He merely took Clara by the arm once the constable had finished his questioning, leading her out into the sunlight. Miss Marple, rising slowly from her chair, lingered a moment, her eyes falling on the constable's notes. In his clumsy handwriting was a curious line. Clara mentioned handbag. Then she stopped herself. Miss Marple's mind pricked at once. The handbag again. The missing handbag. She left the station with unhurried steps, her thoughts knitting themselves together as neatly as the wool in her bag. She passed by the village green, where Mrs. Hargreaves and Mrs. Denton were already spreading the tale that Clara had been formally accused. Gossip moved faster than any constable, and suspicion had already hardened in the villagers' minds. At the edge of the green, Miss Marple paused. Mr. Harcourt himself was striding down the lane, his face flushed, his cane tapping impatiently. He stopped when he saw her, offering a curt nod. "Terrible business, Miss Marple. Simply dreadful. I hardly know how I shall repair the reputation of my salon after such a scandal. Already half the town is whispering that I cannot keep order in my own establishment." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "It must be very trying, Mr. Harcourt. One can only hope the truth comes to light quickly. You were speaking with Mrs. Fortescue just before her collapse, were you not?" Harcourt's eyes flickered. A trivial matter. Nothing at all. She was agitated, as she often was. Nervous sort of woman, hardly worth remarking on. Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice mild as ever. I only wondered because it seemed she looked rather fearful at that moment. I've so often seen fear in the eyes of women. It is something one recognizes. Harcourt's mouth tightened. People see what they wish to see. Good day to you, Miss Marple. And with that, he swept off, his cane striking hard against the cobbles. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression serene. Yet in her mind, the pattern grew clearer. A missing handbag, a fearful glance, a young woman silenced by hesitation, and a proud man far too concerned with appearances. Each was a thread in the tapestry of deceit. As she turned toward her cottage, she murmured softly to herself, "One always knows if one has eyes to see." The question is never whether there is a secret, only whose secret it is. The sun dipped lower over St. Mildred's, but within the tidy streets and neat gardens, tension was rising. Gossip had made its choice of culprit, but Miss Marple knew better. The truth was never so simple, and somewhere in the village, the missing handbag waited, silent and accusing. By the following afternoon, the village of St. Mildred's had worked itself into a frenzy of speculation. What had begun as whispers over bread and butter now spread like ivy across every fence and hedge. Mrs. Fortescue's sudden death had become the single subject of conversation in every parlour, every shop, and every tidy little garden. Miss Marple, seated at her own parlour window with her knitting on her lap, listened with half an ear to the conversation drifting from the lane below. Two young maids, on their way to the grocer's, were speaking in urgent tones. They say she had a letter on her. One insisted. Something dreadful. A threat or a confession. But when they searched her, it was gone. Gone? The other repeated. Well, who would take it? Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Letters had already been hinted at by Mrs. Partridge, and now the gossip was more pointed. If Alicia Fortescue had carried something written, it might explain the missing handbag. Later that day, Miss Marple strolled to the milliner's under the pretense of examining a new batch of ribbons. The shop, conveniently, was a hub for the latest tidings. Mrs. Hargreaves, already stationed by the counter, wasted no time in sharing the latest morsel. "My dear Jane," she said breathlessly, "it's the talk of the village. Mr. Harcourt received a letter from Mrs. Fortescue last week, bold as brass, delivered by hand. And I dare say it was no innocent note about embroidery patterns. He's been in a foul temper ever since. My cousin saw him tearing up papers in his garden just yesterday." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. How very curious. People do so often believe that destroying paper destroys the truth it carries. In my experience, it only makes people more curious about what it said in the first place. Mrs. Hargreaves leaned closer, lowering her voice. Mark my words, she had him in her power, and men like Lionel Harcourt do not take kindly to being managed by women. As she left the milliner's, Miss Marple saw Clara Withers standing on the opposite side of the lane. The girl's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was the envelope she clutched in her hand. When Clara noticed Miss Marple's gaze, she quickly tucked it into her coat and hurried down the street. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet call to Mrs. Partridge at the vicarage once more. The vicar's wife, flushed with excitement, confirmed the growing rumor. "They say Alicia threatened to expose someone," she declared. "Something about business dealings or perhaps a love affair. The letter was to be her weapon, and now it has vanished into thin air, perhaps into the hands of the very one she meant to denounce." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. Human beings, my dear, are often at their most foolish when they believe themselves clever. If Mrs. Fortescue thought to use a letter as a weapon, she may have misjudged the desperation of the one she threatened. The vicar's wife nodded solemnly, but Miss Marple was already deep in thought. A missing handbag, a vanished letter, and a young girl hiding something in plain sight. The pattern was becoming more tangled, but the threads were there, waiting to be drawn together. As she left the vicarage, the bell of St. Mildred's tolled 7. Across the square, Henry Grafton stood with Clara, speaking in low, fierce tones. Clara shook her head, clutching her coat more tightly around her. Henry's hand reached toward her pocket, but she stepped back sharply, refusing to give up whatever it was she held. Miss Marple lingered just long enough to see Henry's eyes darken with anger before the pair disappeared into the shadows of the lane. The letter in question, whether truth or rumor, had already begun to cast its shadow over the village, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that Alicia Fortescue's death was tied not only to poison, but also to words written and now concealed. The question was who feared those words enough to kill. The village of St. Mildred's had scarcely settled from the shock of Alicia Fortescue's death when another disturbance shook its quiet lanes. The following evening, just as the lamps were being lit, a shrill cry rang out near the edge of the square. It came from none other than Clara Withers. Miss Marple, who happened to be returning from the grocer's with a small parcel of tea and sugar, was among the first to arrive. Clara stood beneath the gaslight, her face drained of color, clutching at her coat. Her handbag, a modest, worn leather one, had been torn open, the clasp bent. Scattered across the cobblestones lay a few coins, a lace handkerchief, and a crumpled envelope. Henry Grafton was there too, looking both furious and shaken. Someone tried to snatch it from her, he barked at the small crowd gathering. Out of the shadows, bold as brass, ran off before I could catch them. The villagers, already giddy with gossip, pressed closer. Mrs. Hargreaves clucked in horror. First poison, and now thieves in our very square. What is becoming of our village? Miss Marple bent down, quietly retrieving the envelope. It was blank, though the crease and wear suggested it had been carried about with care. She handed it gently back to Clara, whose trembling fingers snatched it as though it were a lifeline. Constable Barnes, red-faced as ever, puffed on to the scene. "What's all this, then?" he demanded. When he heard Clara's breathless account, his eyes narrowed. Strange, very strange. Either someone wished to frighten you, Miss Withers, or someone knew you carried something worth taking. Clara shook her head fiercely. It was nothing, only letters from my aunt. Nothing important. Her denial rang too quickly and too brightly, and Miss Marple's eyes, calm and blue, rested on her with quiet scrutiny. The girl was hiding something, and whatever it was tied closely to Alicia Fortescue's missing bag. Henry slipped his arm protectively around Clara's shoulders, glaring at the constable. "You'll not badger her further. She's had enough of your suspicions already." Barnes grumbled but made a note, scribbling clumsily in his little book. "Still, I'll wager there's more to this than a common theft. If you ask me, the same hand that poisoned Mrs. Fortescue now means to silence the girl." This declaration sent a ripple of alarm through the bystanders. Mrs. Hargreaves gasped, and young Tom Denton muttered darkly about villains stalking their very doorsteps. Miss Marple, however, did not gasp or mutter. She only stood serenely, her knitting bag hanging from her arm, and said in her mild way, "Curious how these things happen in sequence. One disturbance is often followed by another, like ripples spreading from a single stone tossed into a pond. The question is not only who threw the stone, but why." The crowd eventually dispersed, though the gossip had already taken new life. By the time Miss Marple reached her own cottage, she knew half the village would be saying Clara had been attacked because she carried Alicia's lost letter, while the other half would claim Henry himself staged the whole scene to distract suspicion. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting laid aside, reflecting quietly. She thought of Alicia's fearful glance, of Lionel Harcourt's too eager denial, of Clara's desperate clutch on her envelope, and of Henry's sharp insistence that she say nothing. And now, a thief in the square. Or was it a thief at all? Perhaps it had been nothing so crude. Perhaps it had been someone searching, in haste and desperation, for words that could destroy them. As the fire crackled low, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "One crime may be explained away as an accident. Two so close together cannot. Someone grows reckless, and recklessness, in the end, is often what gives a person away." The following morning would see the village alive with new rumors, and suspicion stretching its fingers further. For now, though, the quiet ticking of the clock in Miss Marple's cottage kept time with her thoughts, and somewhere in St. Mildred's, the one who feared the letter most had shown their hand, if only one knew how to read it. By the next morning, St. Mildred's was buzzing with yet another layer of speculation. The attempted theft of Clara Withers' bag had given the villagers fresh fuel for their whispers, and wherever one walked, voices lowered and eyes gleamed. At the bakery counter, Mrs. Hargreaves whispered that Clara must be hiding Alicia Fortescue's missing letter. At the post office, Mr. Denton swore he had seen Henry Grafton loitering suspiciously near the chemist's 2 days earlier. Suspicion was now spread so thickly over the young pair that even those inclined to kindness hesitated to defend them. Miss Marple, however, saw things rather differently. She knew that when guilt was loudly proclaimed by all, the truth often lay quietly elsewhere. People did not always fear being accused. They feared being discovered, and someone in St. Mildred was afraid enough to try twice at silence, once through poison and once through a snatched handbag. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended the small market on the green. She purchased apples, exchanged pleasantries, and quietly let slip a remark here and there. Her comments seemed idle, almost distracted, but they had a way of setting tongues wagging. "I do wonder," she murmured as she examined a basket of onions, "whether poor Mrs. Fortescue's missing handbag will ever be found. People so often hide such things close to home, though of course they believe themselves very clever in doing so." Within minutes, the remark had flown across the market like a bird set free. Some claimed Miss Marple had suggested the bag was hidden at the Salon itself. Others repeated that it might be found in the Vicorage. The truth of her words mattered less than the effect, and soon she had the chance to observe the suspects' faces as the gossip circled back. Mr. Harcourt, arriving to purchase a cut of lamb, turned scarlet at the mention of the bag. He stammered something about the unseemliness of idle chatter and hurried off. Clara Withers, who had been standing beside the flower stall, blanched and nearly dropped her posy of daisies, and Henry, who joined her a moment later, pulled her roughly aside, speaking in tones too low for the crowd, but not for Miss Marple's sharp ears. "Don't let them bait you, Clara," he hissed. "Say nothing. If you so much as breathe about that letter, it will be the end of us." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. But Henry— "No," he snapped, and his grip on her arm left white marks. Miss Marple's gaze lingered thoughtfully. A guilty conscience, she reflected, rarely bore such sharp edges unless there was more than one secret at stake. Later that evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet call on Dr. Liddon, the village physician, who lived in a neat house near the edge of the green. She brought a jar of her own quince jelly, which she presented with the air of an old lady merely stopping by. The doctor, grateful, poured her a cup of tea and confessed that he was troubled. "It is the odor, Miss Marple," he admitted, his brow furrowed. That bitter almond scent. Cyanide, no doubt, yet the dose must have been cleverly administered. I found no trace in the remaining tea, nor in the scones or sandwiches. It is as though the poison were meant for Mrs. Fortescue alone, slipped to her with great care. Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is curious, is it not, how certain things seem meant for one person only, rather like a letter addressed to a single soul, even if the whole world longs to read it." The doctor agreed gravely, though he did not quite follow her meaning. When Miss Marple left his house, the twilight was gathering, and the lamps along the lane flickered to life. She took her time returning home, pausing to glance at the salon across the square. Its velvet curtains were drawn tight, its doors locked, yet the place seemed to brood like a stage awaiting the return of its actors. She thought of Alicia's fearful eyes, of her missing bag, of a letter that someone feared enough to kill for, and of two young people caught in a net of lies. As she stepped into her own garden gate, she murmured to herself, "It is not always the obvious suspect who holds the truth. More often, it is the one who protests too loudly or who guards their secrets with too much zeal." Inside, she set down her knitting bag and poured herself a simple supper of bread and milk. The fire crackled softly, and the clock ticked on the mantel. But Miss Marple's mind was alive with the movements of her neighbors, their words and gestures fitting together like pieces of a pattern. And as the night deepened, she knew one thing, with certainty. The scandal at the Conservator's Salon was far from over. Another revelation, perhaps another crime, was waiting just around the corner. The threads were beginning to unravel, and when they did, someone's carefully hidden secret would be laid bare. The following afternoon, The village green became the stage for a scene that none of St. Mildred's would forget in a hurry. It began, as so many things did, with gossip. Word had spread that Clara Withers still clung to some mysterious envelope, one that might hold the key to Alicia Fortescue's death. By the time Miss Marple arrived with her basket of knitting wool, a small knot of villagers had already gathered, and voices were rising like a chorus. Clara stood in the center, pale and trembling, with Henry Grafton by her side, with his jaw set in grim defiance. Opposite them loomed Lionel Harcourt, his cane tapping impatiently against the stones. His cheeks were flushed, and his voice carried sharply across the square. "Young woman," he declared, pointing the tip of his cane at Clara, "it is high time you explained yourself. You clutch at that letter as though it were sacred scripture, and yet you expect the rest of us to believe you innocent. Do you deny it? Did Mrs. Fortescue not confide in you? Did she not pass her secrets into your keeping?" Clara stammered, her fingers twisting the handle of her handbag. "I don't know what you mean." Henry stepped forward quickly. "Leave her alone, Harcourt. She owes you no explanation. This persecution is shameful." But Harcourt was not to be silenced. "Shameful. I'll tell you what is shameful, sir. The ruination of my salon, my reputation, and this village's good name, and all because of a woman who meddled in things beyond her station. I will not have my life's work destroyed by whispers and half-truths." The onlookers murmured in approval, some nodding, others whispering behind their hands. To them, Harcourt's indignation sounded plausible. Miss Marple, who had quietly taken a seat on the edge of the fountain, looked from one face to another. She noticed the way Clara's shoulders shook, the way Henry's hand rested too tightly on her arm, and the way Harcourt's eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd each time he spoke, as though measuring the effect of his words. Then, with a suddenness that startled all, Clara burst out, "And I didn't kill her. I didn't, but I know why she died." A gasp swept through the crowd. Henry clutched her arm more tightly, his voice urgent. "Clara, stop!" Not another word. But it was too late. Clara's tears streamed freely as she pulled an envelope from her bag and held it aloft with shaking hands. "She gave me this," she cried. "She said it would protect her if anything happened. But it hasn't protected anyone. It's only brought misery." The villagers surged closer, eyes wide. Constable Barnes, who had just arrived in time to hear the outburst, puffed his chest and attempted to restore order. "Now then, hand it here. Official business, that is." Henry snatched the envelope from Clara before she could move, stuffing it quickly into his coat pocket. "This is nonsense," he said sharply. "Private correspondence. Nothing to do with Mrs. Fortescue's death." Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet piercing, floated across the commotion. "Private correspondence is such an interesting phrase. So often it conceals what people most fear becoming public. Letters, you see, are rather like time bombs, harmless enough until someone dares to read them." Her words hung in the air, and Henry's face flushed scarlet. He turned on her with sudden anger. "You meddle in things that do not concern you, madam." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her knitting bag balanced neatly in her lap. "Oh, but everything in a village concerns one, Mr. Grafton. That is the nature of community. Secrets do not remain private for long, especially when they are guarded with such vehemence." The villagers muttered among themselves, some nodding, others whispering furiously. Clara stood silently, her hands pressed together as though in prayer. Harcourt, seizing the moment, stepped forward once more. "There you have it," he cried. "Proof that letters exist, letters intended to blackmail and destroy. And if Mrs. Fortescue sought to blackmail me, then why not others as well? We must ask ourselves, who else stood in her path?" But even as he spoke, his voice cracked, and his cane slipped slightly against the stones. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth and the sudden sheen of perspiration on his brow. A man too eager to divert suspicion, she thought, is often a man with much to hide. The constable finally asserted himself, declaring that Henry and Clara must bring the envelope to the station. The crowd dispersed slowly, still buzzing with speculation, the air thick with suspicion and unease. As the square emptied, Miss Marple lingered by the fountain. She glanced at the fading light and murmured softly to herself, "Curious indeed. A letter meant to protect, now used to accuse. And yet, the truth is not in the letter alone, but in the way people guard it." She rose, adjusting her shawl, and made her way home, her thoughts knitting themselves into patterns as surely as the wool in her bag. The scandal at the Conservator's Salon was drawing its net tighter, and before long someone would find themselves caught fast. But for now, the village waited, tense, restless, and full of secrets. That very night, St. Mildred's was unsettled once more. The village, usually so quiet after dusk, seemed to hum with nervous energy. Curtains twitched, lamps burned later than usual, and more than one household lingered over supper, discussing the dramatic scene on the green. The question on every tongue was the same. What lay inside that letter, and why was Henry Grafton so determined to keep it from view? Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting, had the curious habit of keeping one candle burning longer than most. From her vantage point, she could see across to the square and the darkened facade of the Conservator's Salon. The building loomed like a stage awaiting its actors, its velvet curtains drawn tight. But even curtains cannot silence whispers, and Miss Marple thought she could feel the secrets pressing against the windows like ghosts eager to be let in. It was close to midnight when the stillness was broken. A figure moved stealthily across the square, dark against the pale moonlight. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles resting in her lap. The figure approached the salon door, fumbling briefly, then slipping inside with surprising ease. Moments later, a second figure followed, smaller, quicker, glancing nervously over a shoulder. This one carried a lantern, and its glow flickered briefly before the door closed behind them. Miss Marple did not move, though her eyes sharpened. She had no need to follow. In her long life, she had learned that what was done in secret was rarely hidden for long. Still, she carefully noted the hour, the direction, and the hurried gait of the intruders. Half an hour passed before a sound shattered the night, a crash, sharp and metallic, followed by a muffled cry. Then came the hurried scuffle of feet, the slam of a door, and the unmistakable echo of running steps across cobblestones. Miss Marple rose, pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and stepped outside into the cool night air. By the time she reached the square, several villagers had emerged from their homes, lanterns bobbing. Constable Barnes, looking disheveled and half-dressed, stumbled into view, his helmet askew. "What's all this?" he demanded, though his voice wavered more from sleep than authority. From the shadows of the lane, Henry Grafton appeared, his face pale, his coat askew. He claimed breathlessly that he had been pursuing a thief. "Someone broke into the salon," he insisted. "I heard them rifling about. When I went in, they struck at me in the dark. I barely escaped." Clara Withers, who had followed close behind, clung to his arm in terror. "He might have been killed," she cried. But even in the confusion, Miss Marple's eyes remained sharp. She noted the way Henry's left hand clutched at his coat pocket as though guarding something within. She noticed, too, that his trousers bore dust not from cobblestones but from a softer floor, as though he had knelt in haste. Barnes, flustered, ordered a search of the salon at once. Lanterns revealed that one of the cabinets had been forced open. Papers lay scattered, drawers pulled wide. Among the debris was a broken porcelain cup, not the one Alicia had dropped, but another of the Salon's fine set. "What were they after?" Barnes muttered. "What could possibly be worth this?" No one answered, but Miss Marple quietly lifted a folded sheet of paper from the floor. She held it up to the lantern light, though the ink was smudged beyond recognition. "It seems," she said gently, "that papers have been of great interest to many of us of late. Perhaps this was yet another letter meant to vanish." Henry stepped forward quickly, snatching the paper from her hand. "This proves nothing," he said, his voice tight. Anyone could have broken in. "Why look at me?" Miss Marple gave him a mild smile, the kind that carried more weight than a dozen accusations. "Oh, I'm not looking at you, Mr. Grafton. I'm only looking at human nature. And it is human nature, is it not? To guard what one fears most will be uncovered." The villagers murmured uneasily. Clara whispered something frantic to Henry, who shook his head sharply. Mr. Harcourt, who had appeared belatedly in his dressing gown, declared with theatrical indignation that his beloved Salon was being treated like a den of thieves. Yet his eyes darted to the broken cabinet with an anxiety he could not hide. At last, Barnes dismissed the crowd, promising to investigate further in the morning. The villagers returned reluctantly to their homes, carrying fresh whispers with them. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gazing up at the darkened salon. A second disturbance, another intrusion, and always the shadow of letters that refused to rest quietly. As she turned back toward her cottage, she murmured softly, "It grows more tangled, like wool knotted upon itself. But even the worst of knots can be undone if one has enough patience." The night closed over St. Mildred's once more, but beneath its calm surface, secrets stirred restlessly, awaiting the light of day. The morning after the break-in at the Conservator's Salon, the village wore a strained expression, as though St. Mildred's itself had grown tired of being disturbed. Shopkeepers muttered while sweeping their thresholds, and conversations paused whenever Henry Grafton or Clara Withers passed by. There was a nervous edge to everything, like the taut string of a violin. Miss Marple, rising early, prepared her tea and bread before setting out toward the square. She had no pressing errands, but she understood that people, when unsettled, could not help but talk. And when people talked, truth had a curious way of slipping between the cracks of gossip. At the bakery, Mrs. Hargreaves leaned over the counter to whisper to a waiting customer. "It wasn't just papers scattered in the salon, mind you. My cousin swears he saw blood on the floorboards. A struggle, clear as day." "Nonsense," the customer replied, though not convincingly. "Henry Grafton made the whole thing up, if you ask me. He was there first, wasn't he?" Miss Marple accepted her loaf with a smile, quietly noting how easily the rumor shifted shape depending on who repeated it. Blood, no blood. What mattered was the eagerness to believe Henry guilty. And yet, she thought, if Henry were truly a killer, would he draw so much attention to himself with such clumsy theatrics? Later that day, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage, where Mrs. Partridge was more than ready with her own version of events. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, "it is all too plain." Alicia Fortescue must have been preparing to expose something dreadful. And now, one by one, her papers are being stolen or destroyed. That is why she carried her handbag so close. That is why she confided in Clara. "Oh, it is blackmail. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, my dear. One does find that threats written in ink can carry far more power than threats spoken aloud. People will endure many things, but the thought of exposure, of being known for what they truly are, that often drives them to desperation." The vicar himself entered just then, his face lined with fatigue. "Desperation, Miss Marple, is precisely what troubles me. A soul driven to such ends is a soul in great peril. I fear we may not have seen the last of this." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "I fear you are right, Reverend. When people are desperate, they often reveal more than they mean to." As she left the vicarage, she encountered Lionel Harcourt striding down the lane, his cane striking sharply against the stones. His expression was dark, his movements jerky with impatience. Miss Marple, he said stiffly, this nonsense must be put to rest. My salon is my life's work, and yet I find it treated as the scene of crime after crime. It is intolerable. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. I can quite understand, Mr. Harcourt. One invests one's pride in such ventures. Still, it is odd, is it not, that Mrs. Fortescue should choose your salon as the place to make her final stand, almost as though she wished her secret to come to light there, before all the village. Harcourt's eyes flickered. You speak as though she planned her own death. Absurd. She was a foolish woman, fond of dramatics. Nothing more. Miss Marple smiled faintly but said no more. His irritation, his defensiveness, these things spoke more clearly than words. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. As she sat with her knitting, she reflected on the threads so far, a missing handbag, a vanished letter, a girl too frightened to speak, and a man too eager to silence her. A proud proprietor trembling for his reputation, and a dead woman whose eyes had shone with fear before she fell. The pattern was not yet complete, but she could sense its shape. Alicia Fortescue had held a weapon, not a knife or a gun, but knowledge. She had threatened someone with words written in her careful hand, and someone, fearing those words, had struck first. The question remained, which of them feared exposure enough to poison a woman in full view of the village? As the clock chimed the hour, Miss Marple murmured softly, secrets weigh more heavily on the soul than any stone. And sooner or later the weight proves too much for even the most practiced liar. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the restless murmur of a village still trapped in the shadow of scandal. The following morning dawned grey and unsettled, the kind of sky that seemed to promise both rain and secrets. St. Mildred's wore its unease openly. Now the children on their way to school walked in clusters, whispering, while shopkeepers kept one eye on the street as they served their customers. It was as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation. That revelation came from an unexpected quarter. Miss Marple had taken her customary walk toward the lane by the conservatory gardens, a place where villagers often strolled after Sunday service. She was not surprised to find Mrs. Partridge already there, bustling about with the excuse of gathering flowers, though her eyes were bright with curiosity. "My dear Jane," she began the moment she saw her, "something dreadful has been found." Before Miss Marple could inquire, a boy of about 12 came running from the hedge, breathless with excitement. "It's true," he cried, behind the conservatory, under the laurel bushes. "There's a bag, a lady's bag." Word spread almost instantly, and within the hour a small crowd had gathered by the iron gates of the Conservator's Salon. Constable Barnes, puffed up with importance, held up his hand for silence. Yes, a handbag has been discovered. It appears to belong to the late Mrs. Fortescue. Everyone keeps coming back while I examine it. The bag was scuffed, its clasp bent, and soil clung to the corners as though it had been hastily buried. Barnes opened it clumsily, pulling out a lace handkerchief, a small mirror, a powder compact, and several letters tied with a blue ribbon. The sight of them drew a collective gasp. "There you have it," Mrs. Hargreaves exclaimed. "The very letters she used to blackmail poor Mr. Harcourt." Harcourt, who stood at the edge of the crowd, flushed scarlet. "This is an outrage. To suggest I was at the mercy of that woman is absurd." He turned to the constable. "I demand those letters be secured at once. Their contents must not be made public." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the gate, spoke softly, almost as if to herself. How very curious that the bag should turn up here, of all places. One would think, if it was stolen in haste, it might have been cast aside on the road. To bury it carefully suggests someone with both time and fear. Her words, carried by the hush of the crowd, struck like a pebble in still water. All eyes turned toward Harcourt, who stammered, "Preposterous! Anyone could have placed it there. It is a public garden." Barnes, scribbling furiously in his notebook, looked uncertain. Still, it is mighty strange it was here, so close to the salon. Clara Withers, pale as milk, stepped forward unexpectedly. "It's true," she whispered. "She told me she carried letters that could ruin someone. She said she was going to make them confess, once and for all, and now she's dead." The murmurs swelled again, suspicion shifting like wind in a storm. Some pointed at Harcourt, others at Henry Grafton, who stood beside Clara, with a face as rigid as stone. His hand rested firmly in his coat pocket, as though guarding something unseen. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on that hand, then moved gently back to Clara's frightened face. "My dear," she said kindly, "truth is not a burden meant for the young to carry alone. Secrets passed from one hand to another only grow heavier, and heavy burdens, sooner or later, will break someone." Henry's jaw tightened. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Clara is innocent. She has suffered enough without being dragged into Mrs. Fortescue's foolish games." But Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice mild. "It is often the games people call foolish that reveal the most serious truth, Mr. Grafton. I've seen it many times." Constable Barnes gathered the bag and letters with fumbling hands, declaring they must be taken to the station. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, their whispers already forming new theories. As Miss Marple walked home along the quiet lane, her thoughts knit themselves together. Alicia Fortescue's bag, hidden near the salon, its letters tied with ribbon. A fearful woman died. A proud man was cornered. A young girl trembled, and a young man grasped too tightly to something he dared not reveal. She paused at her garden gate, her eyes distant. "It comes clearer now," she murmured softly. "Fear makes people bury things, but fear also makes them careless, and it is in carelessness that truth most often slips free." The church bell tolled in the distance, its solemn notes carrying across the village. St. Mildred was bracing herself for the scandal's next turn, though none yet knew what the letters might hold. But Miss Marple knew one thing with quiet certainty. The true danger lay not in the words on paper, but in the hearts of those who would kill to keep them hidden. The following day, St. Mildred's awoke to a storm of curiosity. The discovery of Alicia Fortescue's handbag and its bundle of letters had set the village ablaze with speculation. Who were the letters written to, and what dreadful secrets did they contain? By breakfast, half the households claimed to know their contents, though each story contradicted the last. Miss Marple, never one to hurry, finished her porridge, adjusted her shawl, and set out for the police station. She had learned long ago that in small villages, the truth often reached one's ears faster by listening quietly than by demanding answers. Constable Barnes, flustered and red-faced, was already struggling with the sudden importance of his role. The letters had been examined in private that morning, but word had leaked as it always did. When Miss Marple arrived, he looked both relieved and wary to see her. "Well, Miss Marple," he began, "you'll hear of it soon enough, so I may as well tell you straight. The letters, they were written by Mrs. Fortescue herself. Not to just one person, mind you, but several. And each one contained—" He lowered his voice. "Accusations, damaging accusations." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. How very human of her. Letters can be so useful when one wishes to keep people in check. But tell me, Constable, were the accusations true? Barnes flushed. "That's not for me to say. But one of them was addressed to Mr. Harcourt, another to Dr. Liddon, and one more," he hesitated, "to Henry Grafton. She claimed he owed her money, a good deal of it by the sound." It was a revelation that would not stay quiet. By midday, the village was seething with talk. To accuse Harcourt of dubious dealings was one thing, but to suggest Henry Grafton, so aloof and proud, was entangled in debts to Alicia. Fortescue was a scandal of its own. Clara Withers, poor girl, looked near collapse. Miss Marple found her outside the church, clutching her prayer book as though it might shield her from the world. They all believe it, Clara whispered. They think Henry killed her to be free of the debt. But he didn't. He couldn't. He's not like that. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. My dear, people are rarely only one thing. A man may be kind to one and cruel to another. The question is not whether Henry is capable of love, but whether he is capable of desperation. And desperation, you see, can drive people to dreadful acts. Clara's eyes filled with tears. He only borrowed from her because she offered. He was writing a book, and she promised to help, but then she threatened to ruin him if he didn't repay her. She mocked him and said he was too proud and too poor. He hated her for it. I know he did. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her thoughts sharpened. Clara had said more than she intended. To borrow was one thing, to be mocked publicly was quite another. Pride could wound more deeply than poverty. That evening, the villagers gathered in small knots along the square, voices rising in heated arguments. Some declared Harcourt guilty, pointing to the handbag buried near his salon. Others insisted Henry Grafton had the clearest motive now that the letters had come to light. A few even muttered about Dr. Liddon, whose name had appeared unexpectedly among the recipients. Miss Marple walked among them quietly, hearing every word, though she offered little in return. Her mind, like her knitting, was busy threading the pieces together. Alicia had written letters, each a weapon. She had divided her accusations among several, ensuring that if one person did not fear her, another surely would. It was clever, but also reckless. For by scattering suspicion, she had planted the seeds of her own destruction. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple caught sight of Mr. Harcourt retreating down the lane, his cane tapping furiously. His face was drawn, his lips pressed thin, and he muttered to himself as though rehearsing an argument. At the same moment, Henry Grafton emerged from the shadows near the church, his eyes following Harcourt with something between hatred and fear. Miss Marple paused at the corner, her knitting bag on her arm, and murmured softly, 3 letters, 3 wounds to pride. And pride, once wounded, can be more dangerous than any poison. The bell of St. Mildred struck the hour, echoing over the village rooftops. In its solemn tolling, one could almost hear the weight of secrets pressing down, ready to burst. The scandal was no longer confined to the salon. It had seeped into every corner of the village, and Miss Marple knew it would not rest until the truth, however bitter, was revealed. The evening after the letters were revealed, the vicarage became the reluctant meeting ground for half the village. Mrs. Partridge, delighted by the drama, though feigning concern, had invited a handful of neighbours for tea. By the time Miss Marple arrived, shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, the gathering had already grown beyond its intended number. Villagers crammed into the drawing-room, voices rising and falling in waves of speculation. Lionel Harcourt stood stiffly by the fireplace, cane tapping against the hearthstone in sharp, impatient beats. His cheeks were ruddy with agitation. Clara Withers sat near the window, her hands clutched around a teacup as if it were an anchor. Beside her, Henry Grafton's dark eyes flashed with irritation at every whisper directed their way. Dr. Liddon had been persuaded to attend as well, though he looked distinctly uncomfortable, dabbing at his brow with a handkerchief. The air was thick with unease. Everyone seemed to believe that the contents of Alicia Fortescue's letters had condemned one or all of these individuals. Yet no one spoke the accusation aloud. Not until Mrs. Hargreaves, emboldened by the company, said in a voice far too loud for the small room, "If you ask me, Alicia Fortescue was silenced because she threatened to expose the truth, and the ones she wrote to know very well what I mean." A collective murmur followed, heads turning toward Harcourt, Henry, and Doctor Liddon in turn. Harcourt's voice broke through, sharp and defensive. "This is intolerable. The word of a bitter woman, written in letters meant to wound, is hardly evidence of anything. She thrived on scandal. She would say anything to feel important." Dr. Liddon shifted uneasily. Even so, Lionel, her words were not without consequence. She accused me of mismanaging medicine, of all things. Utter nonsense, of course. But nonsense has a way of growing dangerous once it takes hold. Henry, his jaw tight, rose abruptly. And she accused me of debt. Yes, I borrowed from her. She offered, and I accepted. But it was no crime. I intended to repay her when my book was finished. His eyes blazed as he glared around the room. If that is cause for suspicion, then let them suspect. I will not cower to gossip. Clara's voice trembled as she broke in. Henry, please. But he silenced her with a raised hand. Through all this, Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner chair, her knitting needles clicking gently. She seemed entirely absorbed in her work, yet her gaze flitted from face to face, noting every twitch, every glance, and every hastily spoken word. At last she spoke, her voice soft and almost apologetic. It does seem to me that poor Mrs. Fortescue had a talent for observing people's weak points, not unlike the way some gardeners can always tell which plant will fail in poor soil. She used that knowledge, it seems, rather unkindly. Yet one must remember people rarely kill for truth. They kill for fear of what others may think is true. Her words silenced the room for a moment, the meaning settling heavily. Mrs. Partridge gave a little nervous laugh. How very profound, Jane. But surely you don't mean to suggest I mean only, Miss Marple continued mildly, that one should not focus too much on whether Mrs. Fortescue's letters were accurate. What matters is that she is frightened by writing them. Harcourt flushed deeper, his cane striking the floor. And you think she frightened me? Preposterous. Henry's lips curled. You were furious with her, Harcourt. Everyone saw it. She mocked you openly at the Salon, and you hated her for it. And you, Harcourt snapped back, stood to lose everything if her words spread. A proud young man ruined before he even began. Tell me, who had the greater motive? The room erupted into overlapping accusations, voices rising, tempers fraying. Clara began to sob quietly, and Dr. Liddon muttered that he should never have come. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked calmly through the chaos. She waited until the noise had reached its peak before setting her work gently on her lap. I should think, she said softly, yet with a clarity that cut through the room, that the one who has the most to lose is not always the one who shouts the loudest. Sometimes it is the one who stays quiet, hoping no one notices. All eyes turned at once, though no one was certain whom she meant. Before another word could be spoken, a loud crash echoed from outside, the sound of glass shattering. The vicar's wife gasped, and several villagers rushed to the window. In the garden, a lantern lay broken, its flame snuffed by the damp earth. No figure could be seen, but the clear impression remained that someone had been listening. The crowd spilled out into the garden, but no intruder was found. Only trampled grass and the lingering sense that eyes had been watching from the shadows. When at last they returned indoors, unsettled and murmuring, Miss Marple sat serenely, her hands folded atop her knitting. You see, she said quietly, the truth has a way of pressing close, even when it wishes, to remain hidden. Sooner or later, it always makes itself known. Her words, though gentle, left the company uneasy, and as the gathering broke apart, each suspect carried with them the heavy knowledge that the walls of secrecy were closing in. The morning after the tense gathering at the vicarage, St. Mildred's awoke to yet another scandal. Rumors ran ahead of fact, carried in hurried whispers through the lanes, until by mid-morning every villager knew that something dreadful had happened at Dr. Liddon's house. Miss Marple, walking briskly with her basket, was met on the green by Mrs. Hargreaves, who was already breathless with excitement. "My dear Jane, you've heard, of course. The doctor had his surgery broken into. His medicine cabinet was rifled through." "It's too terrible." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "How very distressing." A physician's trust is such a fragile thing. When it is tampered with, one wonders if the motive is theft or concealment. She continued on toward the doctor's house, where Constable Barnes stood on the doorstep, trying to keep order among the gawkers. Inside, Dr. Liddon paced, his hands twisting together. The surgery shelves were in disarray, bottles overturned, and powders spilled across the floor. They took nothing of value, he insisted when Miss Marple asked gently what had gone missing. Not money, not instruments. Only one small vial is unaccounted for. His eyes darted toward the shelf. Hydrogen cyanide, a restricted preparation. I kept it locked away. A murmur rippled through the villagers who had pressed close enough to hear. Cyanide is the very poison suspected in Alicia Fortescue's death. Constable Barnes puffed up importantly. This proves it then. Someone stole it and used it on her. That settles the matter. Now all we must do is find who had the chance. But Miss Marple's soft voice cut through his bluster. Not quite, Constable. One must ask, not only who could have taken it, but why the vial should vanish now, after Mrs. Fortescue is already gone. Sometimes, you see, thieves take not to use, but to hide what has already been used. Her words settled heavily in the room. Henry Grafton, who had appeared late at the scene, looked sharply toward Clara, as though fearful she might speak. Clara's pale face grew whiter still, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. Later that afternoon, the vicarage again became a hub of gossip. Mrs. Partridge wrung her hands dramatically as she recounted what she had heard. Dr. Liddon insists he kept the vial locked, but what if it had been tampered with long before last night? What if Alicia's poison was taken weeks ago? Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. Locks, my dear, are very like reputations. They give a sense of safety, though in truth they are often far weaker than they appear. Those who most wish to hide things find ways to do so. The village divided itself once more. Some insisted Harcourt had arranged the theft, to clear suspicion from himself. Others pointed at Henry, declaring the debt gave him the strongest motive. Still others murmured darkly that the doctor himself had reason enough to silence Alicia if she threatened to expose him. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth, knitting needles resting on her lap. She thought of the bag buried near the salon, of letters that wounded pride, of Clara's trembling hands, of Henry's sharp outbursts, of Harcourt's defensiveness, and now of a vial stolen or perhaps concealed to blur the truth. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and in the distance the church bell tolled 7. Miss Marple spoke softly into the silence, her voice steady. The pattern is nearly complete. Fear, pride, and concealment, they weave a web around the guilty. And webs, once spun, can be traced back to their maker. But even as she said it, a knock came at her door. It was Clara Withers, her eyes wide with terror. Miss Marple, she whispered, clutching her hands together, I can't keep silent any longer. If I do, there will be another death. And with those words, the scandal at the Conservator's salon took its darkest turn. Yet, it was Miss Marple who suggested, in her quiet and unassuming way, that the best course of action would be to bring everyone together. After all, she said gently to Constable Barnes, truth is rather like cream. However much it is stirred, it always rises to the top. Sometimes one only needs the right bowl in which to let it settle. And so, that evening, the Conservator's salon, which had been closed since Alicia Fortescue's death, was reopened, not for music or embroidery, but for the uncomfortable business of facing suspicion. The velvet curtains still hung heavy. The polished floor gleamed faintly in the lantern light, and the very air seemed to hum with the memory of scandal. Lionel Harcourt stood near the stage, restless and flushed, his cane striking the boards in a sharp rhythm. Henry Grafton sat with arms folded, his expression defiant, while Clara Withers sat close by, trembling, her eyes darting from one face to another. Dr. Liddon, weary and pale, dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. A scattering of villagers and Mrs. Partridge herself lingered in the background, eager to see the spectacle but trying not to look too eager. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, knitting in her lap, her voice soft and almost apologetic. "We are gathered, I think, not for accusations but for clarity. A woman has died. Letters have been found, and secrets, I fear, have weighed heavily on more than one among us. If we are to restore peace to St. Mildred's, the shadows must be brought into the open." Constable Barnes puffed up. "Hear, hear. Now, I've said all along it was likely Clara here, or young Grafton. They had the chance, and that letter business only makes it worse. But Miss Marple thought we ought to hear everyone's account at once." So he gestured, clumsily. "Let's have it out." Harcourt's cane struck the floor again. "I, for one, am tired of being slandered. Yes, Mrs. Fortescue wrote me a letter. Yes, she threatened to reveal nonsense about my finances, but I did not stoop to murder to silence her. A man of my standing has no need for such methods." Henry gave a sharp laugh. "Your standing, Harcourt, is built on borrowed reputation. Everyone knows you're desperate to keep your salon respectable. She threatened you, and you hated her for it. And you, sir," Harcourt snapped, "stood to lose more than pride. Debts unpaid, reputation ruined before it even began, and all at the hands of a woman you despised. Tell me, who had more to gain?" Clara flinched at their raised voices. "Stop it!" she cried suddenly. "All of you stop! She's dead, and we do nothing but argue over who hated her more. Don't you see? That's why she's gone. She fed on your pride and your secrets, and now we're feeding on the same poison." The room fell into uneasy silence. Even Harcourt's cane was still. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her voice calm. "My dear Clara is quite right. It is pride that has led us here." Mrs. Fortescue understood that too well. She knew where to place her finger, and she pressed it hard. To some it was money. To others it was reputation. To yet another, perhaps professional standing. Each was wounded in their own way, but only one among you was desperate enough to act. Her eyes drifted slowly around the room, never accusing, merely observing. Harcourt shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. Dr. Liddon looked away, his face drawn. Henry's jaw tightened, his fist clenching on his knee. Clara sat rigid, her breath shallow. The tension in the salon was palpable, each heartbeat loud in the silence. Constable Barnes shuffled his feet nervously, his eyes flicking from one suspect to another as though expecting a sudden confession. Then Miss Marple continued, her tone almost conversational. "A curious thing about handbags. They rarely wander far from their owner unless taken, and when taken they are usually discarded quickly. But this one was not. It was hidden, carefully buried near the very salon where its owner drew her last breath. That speaks of someone bound not only by panic, but also by proximity. Someone who feared discovery too close to home." Harcourt's face turned crimson. "Are you implying something?" Miss Marple raised her hand gently. "No, Mr. Harcourt. I'm only noting what anyone with eyes might see. The guilty, you know, often reveal themselves not in what they confess, but in how violently they deny." At that moment, a noise startled the company. Clara let out a sharp cry, dropping her teacup, which shattered on the floor. Henry leapt to his feet, his hand gripping her shoulder too firmly, too quickly. "Enough!" he barked. "This circus is intolerable. We've no reason to sit here and be picked apart like characters in some dreadful melodrama." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him steadily. But you see, Mr. Grafton, reason is exactly what we need. Without it, suspicion breeds endlessly, and suspicion, once begun, will not stop until the truth is spoken." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unsaid words. Clara's eyes filled with tears, Harcourt's cane shook in his hand, and Dr. Liddon dabbed at his brow though the room was cool. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her tone gentle but resolute. "The truth will come out. It always does. And when it does, I fear it will not be kind." The gathering broke reluctantly, villagers whispering as they left the salon, but the atmosphere was charged, like the air before a storm. Everyone knew that the final reckoning was close. And in the quiet corner of the salon, Miss Marple sat alone for a moment, her needles still. She gazed at the empty stage, her expression unreadable, before murmuring softly, "Tomorrow will bring the answer. Tomorrow, the mask must fall." The next evening, as the church bell tolled 7, the villagers once again gathered at the Conservator's salon. This time it was not curiosity or gossip that brought them, but something heavier: expectation. Constable Barnes had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to let Miss Marple conduct what she called a little sorting out of matters. He muttered that it was highly irregular, but the truth was that even he had begun to sense she knew more than anyone else. The salon was hushed as the company assembled. Lionel Harcourt stood by the fireplace, pale but attempting dignity. Dr. Liddon occupied a chair nearby, his eyes hollow. Henry Grafton loomed beside Clara Withers, his hand tight upon hers as if daring her to speak. The rest of the villagers pressed at the edges of the room, hungry for the unmasking. Miss Marple sat serenely in her chair, her knitting needles still for once. Her eyes twinkled with their usual mildness, though her voice carried clearly when she began. "My dear friends," she said, "we have all been most disturbed by recent events. A woman is dead, letters have been unearthed, and suspicions have scattered like autumn leaves. But the truth, as it so often does, lies not in the noise of accusation, but in the small things one notices, if one is patient." She looked first to Harcourt. Mr. Harcourt feared scandal above all else. Mrs. Fortescue taunted him with letters that threatened his reputation. He blustered and protested, but in the end, pride made him loud, not guilty. For though he feared exposure, he was too concerned with appearances to risk the crude work of poison. Harcourt flushed, but a murmur of agreement stirred among the villagers. Turning her gaze, she addressed Dr. Liddon. The good doctor, too, had reason to worry. A letter accusing him of mismanaging medicines might have destroyed his practice, and then his surgery was broken into, his vial of cyanide missing. At first glance, that points to guilt. Yet one must ask, why would a guilty man draw attention to the very shelf where poison lay? No, the theft was not his doing. It was a clumsy attempt to shift suspicion onto him. The doctor let out a shaky breath, relief flickering in his eyes. Now Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara and Henry. Clara's eyes filled with tears, while Henry's jaw tightened, his hand tightening cruelly on hers. "It was in Clara's handbag," Miss Marple continued softly, "that I noticed the strangest thing. A crease where no crease should have been, as though a letter had been folded and unfolded too many times. She was frightened, yes, but not guilty. Fair in the young is easily distinguished from deceit." Clara sobbed quietly. Henry leaned toward her, whispering fiercely, "Say nothing." Miss Marple's voice sharpened, though it never rose. "And then there is Henry Grafton, a proud young man, burdened with debt, mocked by Mrs. Fortescue for his weakness. She lent him money, yes, but when he could not repay, she turned cruel. She threatened him with exposure, with humiliation. For Henry, pride was everything, better ruin than mockery, better murder than shame." Henry shot to his feet. "Lies!" he shouted. "All lies. You twist every word, every look, until it fits your story. She was a bitter old woman. If anyone killed her, it was Harcourt, not I." But his outburst betrayed him. Miss Marple's calm eyes never left him. "And yet, Henry, it was you who clutched your coat pocket so tightly the night of the break-in. You who silenced Clara at every turn. You who had soil on your trousers when the handbag was buried. Small things, easily overlooked, but quite impossible to explain away. The room was silent but for Clara's sobs. Harcourt's cane tapped nervously, and Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Henry's voice cracked. "She deserved it," he muttered. "She tormented me and mocked me. Said I was nothing, that I would always be nothing. I only meant to frighten her. The poison was just a drop, enough to warn her. But she drank, and she died so quickly. And then everything spiraled out of control." Clara covered her face with her hands, weeping. Constable Barnes, recovering himself, stepped forward awkwardly. "Henry Grafton, you are under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Alicia Fortescue." The villagers gasped, some in pity, others in grim satisfaction. Harcourt exhaled sharply, muttering something about reputations, while Dr. Liddon sank back in relief. Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting, her expression gentle yet tinged with sorrow. "It is always pride," she murmured. "Pride and fear." Mrs. Fortescue wielded her knowledge like a weapon, and Henry, wounded in his pride, struck back in kind. One cannot excuse it, but one may understand it. And in understanding, one sees how easily tragedy grows from the smallest of human weaknesses. The salon was hushed as Henry was led away, his head bowed. The scandal that had begun with a broken teacup had ended with the unmasking of a murderer. Yet Miss Marple knew the ripples would linger long after the crime itself was solved. The days following Henry Grafton's arrest moved slowly, as though St. Mildred's itself were trying to shake off the weight of scandal. The news spread quickly beyond the village, carried in the county paper with the bold headline, "Murder at the Conservator's Salon. Young author arrested." To those in St. Mildred's, the words felt both too large and too small. Too large because the village seemed exposed to the outside world in a most uncomfortable way, and too small because the story could never capture the unease that lingered in every corner. Clara Withers withdrew almost entirely from sight. She was seen only once, at her aunt's house, pale and thin, her eyes hollow with grief and shame. Some pitied her, others whispered she must have known more than she admitted. Gossip was kinder to Lionel Harcourt, though not by much. His salon, once the pride of the village, it now stood as a reminder of what had taken place there. He declared he would reopen it within a month, but even he knew music could not drown out memory so quickly. Dr. Liddon walked the lanes with a lighter step, though he never quite shook the shadow of his near involvement. His patients returned hesitantly at first, then more freely, comforted by the thought that suspicion had passed him by. Still, the whispered phrase, "the missing vial," lingered in more than one drawing-room. As for the villagers, they did what villagers always do. They retold the tale at length, embellishing the details, making the crime grander and more dramatic than it had been. Some swore they had suspected Henry all along. Others claimed they had seen him in dark corners with murder in his eyes. And in every shop, parlour, and garden, the scandal became a story to be polished and passed along. Through it all, Miss Marple went about her quiet routines. She knitted by her window, tended her garden, and walked to the church each Sunday. Yet she remained, as always, the quiet centre of the storm. People looked at her with a mixture of admiration and unease, for though she never boasted, everyone knew it was she who had drawn the threads together, she who had spoken aloud the truth that others would not see. One afternoon, Mrs. Partridge visited Miss Marple for tea, eager to reflect on the matter now that it had been concluded. "Such a dreadful business," she said, pouring the tea with trembling hands. "And yet, perhaps it is a kind of mercy." Alicia Fortescue was not a kind woman, Jane. She hurt with words where others could never reach. Still, to die so suddenly, so cruelly, one shudders to think. Miss Marple stirred her cup gently. "Yes, my dear, but one must remember, cruelty rarely springs from malice alone. Often it is born from disappointment, from bitterness at one's own life. Poor Mrs. Fortescue lived for secrets because she had so little else. She forgot that secrets are like matches. They may light a fire, but more often they burn the hand that holds them. Mrs. Partridge sighed, and Henry's promise wasted. Pride can be a dreadful thing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled softly. Indeed, pride is more dangerous than greed, more dangerous even than envy. Pride convinces a person that their reputation is worth more than a life, and when one believes that, tragedy is never far behind. The vicar's wife nodded solemnly, then changed the subject to the coming fete, already being planned as a way to restore some cheer. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the faces she had seen, the small gestures and words that had betrayed so much. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned cool, Miss Marple sat alone in her garden. The roses trembled lightly in the breeze, their scent mingling with the faint smoke from nearby chimneys. She folded her knitting and looked toward the square where the Salon stood, dark against the fading sky. She thought of Alicia Fortescue, proud, lonely, clutching her letters as if they might give her power. She thought of Henry, brought low by his own pride, his life ruined before it had properly begun. And she thought of Clara, who would carry the weight of his downfall like a shadow across her future. With a quiet sigh, Miss Marple rose and went inside, pausing only to glance once more at the village she loved. Life would return to its rhythms, as it always did. Gossip would fade, scandal would soften, and in time, the Conservator's Salon would open its doors again. But beneath the neat lawns and polished teacups, human nature would remain the same, full of vanity, secrets, and frailty. And with a faint smile, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "Murder may shock a village, but it is pride that truly lingers."